Before I get started, want to invite you to give a big round of applause to Melissa and Jasmine for organizing this event. It's been exceptional since the very beginning, so thank you very much. And everybody else, I mean, the whole Iron Source team, I'm sure all lent a hand, so thank you very much for inviting me. This is a wonderful venue, and I'm really happy to be here. So who am I? As Melissa mentioned, I run a website called Mobile Dev Memo. I also built a Python library for cohort analysis for marketers called Theseus. It's open source. It's on GitHub. And I run Heracles, which is a venture fund. Okay, and previously I worked at a number of consumer tech companies that you might be familiar with. Okay, so agenda for this talk. So I'm going to start with kind of an overview of why I'm even discussing this today. Because who here was at the last Game Fest? So we're at Appfest now as a Game Fest. So the last time you were here, measurement was kind of settled science, right? We didn't really think about it. It just sort of happened. And that's not true anymore. And so I want to talk about what the catalyst for that change was. I want to talk about going probabilistic with measurement. I want to talk about on-site measurement, and then I want to talk about content fortresses. This goes back further than maybe you know, right? So this idea of like an encroachment of privacy into the way that we operate, right? We as marketers, is an old idea. It's not a new idea, right? So it actually kind of started in 2017 with an addition to the Safari library called Intelligent Tracking Prevention. And so ITP basically disrupted cookies, right? So web cookies store data about what a user has browsed, what websites users visited within the browser. That information is used by advertising platforms to target ads to people, right? To personalize ads to people, but only on the web, right? A cookie's a web thing, and it only really moderates web usage, right? And then we had ATT, right? So ATT announced at WWDC in 2020, rolled out April 2021, but really like July 2021. We're all familiar with it. Then we have iCloud Private Relay, right? So that was kind of the next step, right? If you think about ITP wants to moderate what access ad networks have to your behavioral history just in Safari. Then you had ATT, where it moderates what access ad networks have to your in-app usage. Then we had Private Relay, which kind of sequesters your phone away from the internet, right? It turns your phone into a private internet operating environment where nothing can really leave. Now, this is only for iCloud Plus subscribers. There's a separate version in Chrome for the iPhone. But nonetheless, I mean, I think at some point this probably gets rolled out to all app traffic, right? Not just iCloud Plus subscribers, all phone traffic. And so your phone will be its own browsing environment that doesn't really directly connect to properties on the internet, whether they be apps or websites, right? Mail privacy protection, right? Hide my email. That means when you sign up for a new service, they don't get your email. They get some Apple kind of scrambled burner email, right? Now, I don't know if you know this, but Apple started sending ads to iPhone owners via email, right? Because they have your email, but all the services that you subscribe to might not. Because if you use Hide My Email, they only have this Apple email address, right? That won't just forward everything that gets sent to you, right? Now, Android announced that they're going to deprecate the GAID, right? So pretty much the equivalent of ATT on Android. There are some substantial differences. I'm not going to unpack those today. But they're going actually even farther than ATT did, right? Because they're just doing away with the GAID entirely. There's no opt-in, right? Now, they're going to replace that with tools that allow marketers to do their jobs, right? They've talked about the Privacy Sandbox in Android. They talked about Fledge. They talked about Topics API, right? They talked about the ads attribution API. These are things that Apple didn't introduce with ATT. And so it'll be easier to adapt. But nonetheless, they are going further than Apple did with the deprecation of the GID, right? And we have legislation that is going to sort of supersede all of this, right? Because these are platform policies. It's not law. But there are laws coming that supersede everything, right? One of these laws in the US, the Banning Surveillance Advertising Act, goes pretty far, right? It's more extreme than the GDPR, right? We have the ADPPA in the US. Now, these are just proposed laws, so they're bills, right? They're not actual law yet. But we have the DSA in Europe, the DMA in Europe. Those were signed into law. Those are codified into law. That's going to change the way that you operate, right? So this is all just to say that you're probably most familiar with ATT, but there's a background, there's a history of these privacy changes that kind of predate ATT, right? And there are things that are happening that are going to go even further than ATT, right? And if they become law, then they supersede ATT, right? And so these are all things that, the privacy environment is not settled, right? It's not permanent. It's going to be changing, right? It's going to be evolving. And these are considerations that you need to acknowledge. So what did ATT actually do? So this is a diagram that I've shared on my website, and it kind of describes the flow of data, right, between a publisher and an ad network and an advertiser, right? And so the basic idea of this is what I call a hub and spoke model, by the way. The hub is the ad platform. The hub is Facebook, Snap, these owned and operated ad platforms where they own the inventory that they're selling, right? They sit between an advertiser, which is someone that wants to buy ads, and the site, right? The site that the advertiser is trying to drive traffic to. And that's an app, right? Or that's a website, right? And so the flow of data happens when the advertiser buys an ad on the platform, a user clicks that ad, they go to the advertiser's site, right, app or website, they do some stuff, and the fact that that stuff got done gets sent back to the platform, right? So that's the hub. The hub is the platform. It captures that data, and it uses it to enrich the profile of the user that clicked the ad, right? So maybe they bought something, maybe they added something to the cart, they did something significant that the advertiser sort of demarcated as significant, they capture that data, they attach it to that user's profile, and they use that to target better ads in the future. And then through that ability to profile, they're also able to deliver lookalike audiences to the advertiser. They say, hey, well, this person did something that you think is important, let us find other people that we think would also do that thing, and we'll target your ads at those people, right? And so ultimately, it's kind of like a data co-op, right? I give my data to the platform. They use my data to benefit. Other people's campaigns, right? Because that platform now knows that this user did something significant on my site, but they use other people's data to benefit my campaign. So go find me people that look like the people that did something significant on my site based on what they've done on other people's sites, right? And so if you think about pre-ATT, what happened was you have this vast pool universe of people, right? And the way that kind of marketers tend to think about them is sort of sliced by demographic features, right? So that could be age, gender, it could be geography, but those aren't really meaningful for targeting. Those are meaningful for just breaking the groups down into smaller groups, but that's not meaningful for targeting people that are likely to do something, right? And so in the previous model, in that hub and spoke model, what happened was you took these groups and they kind of helped you at least kickstart the advertising process. But what you really wanted to do was target the people that had a history of doing what you wanted them to do on your site. And they got pooled together, no matter where they came from, right? So you see people coming from all over this map into this circle, which is just the people that are known purchasers. And you don't really care. You might have done some geo-targeting just to sort of kickstart the process, right? But that's not really what you cared about. What you cared about was find me people that historically have done this thing or that are likely to do this thing in the future. And that's the way that they were pooled prior to ATT. Well, now they can't be pooled that way. And so now what you're trying to do is instead of targeting people that are likely to do something, you're targeting people based on these demographic features, which really aren't predictive, right, for doing something on your app or in your app or on your website, right? And so you get sort of like much more diluted targeting, right, that really is just fed by some sense, some knowledge, some sort of like historical precedent for these large kind of like not very informative group memberships, right? And so the targeting becomes less precise, less informed, right? Therefore, the conversion rates go down, cost of actions goes up, right? And CPMs go up for the same reason. And I've written an article about that. It goes into more depth. It's actually where those diagrams are taken from. And so you break that flow of data. You break the hub and spoke model. You break the flow of data from the sites back to the ad platforms that allowed them to target specific people based on their behaviors. So here's where we're starting from, right? We're starting from just different data sets, right? We used to have a unified data set. My data set was Meta's data set. My data set was Snap's data set, right? And that's not the case anymore, right? Because they don't get to know what happens on my site, right? And I don't really get to know what happens on their site, which is the click interactions, right? Like the ad interactions. I don't get to know that. They don't get to know what happens on my site. These are disparate data sets. I can't send my data to them anymore, right? Because that used to happen, or I can send it, but it's not user identifiable because there's no IDFA anymore, right? And I can't use an email address. I can't use a personal identifier. I can't use an email address in some cases because I don't have it, because I have the hide my email burner email address. So what is probabilistic attribution? That's what we have to do, right? We have two disparate data sets. We have a data set of click interactions, of ad interactions, and we have a data set of on-site advertising, on-site interactions that are purchases, adds to carts, whatever, right? And we have to try to match these disparate data sets. They used to be unified via the IDFA, or the GAID going forward. They won't be, right? Or the email address, which we won't have because hide my email. But they used to be matched at the user level based on these unique identifiers, these deterministic identifiers. Well, we don't have that anymore. And so we have to move into probabilistic attribution. What does that mean? So I would describe it as attribution of advertising outcomes to campaigns using statistical methods for estimation, right? That's a definition that I came up with. So probabilistic attribution models can take a wide variety of inputs and work across different levels of granularity. Probabilistic, quote unquote, is also a catch-all term that can be used to designate any attribution method that isn't strictly deterministic, right? And that's what maybe some of you know as probabilistic attribution is just anything that's not deterministic, right? So any way of attributing someone that's not deterministic, that's probabilistic attribution. I wouldn't define it that way, but that's how it is defined by some platforms, right? In order to sort of parse that definition, we have to understand what's deterministic attribution. So probabilistic attribution is just anything that's not deterministic, and we want to disprove that, or we want to sort of question that, we have to understand what is deterministic, right? So in computer science and math, a deterministic system is one that involves no randomness for transitions between states, right? So one set of inputs will produce one set of outputs for every iteration of the process, right? So there's a function, I push some inputs into it, there's an output. Every time I push that set of inputs into that function, the same set of outputs is produced, right? There's no randomness, it's always the same. One set of inputs produces one set of outputs, right? So there's other applications of the concept. You might have heard of cultural determinism, right? Which is where someone's like a product of their culture, right? Like that person is a product of the culture they grew up in. Kind of the same idea, right? So deterministic attribution is associated with unique identifiers that are absolute, right? IDFA, email, that's personal, that's one-to-one. That's deterministic. That determines who you are because that's unique to you, right? So in a deterministic attribution model, when some identifiers fed into the model, the same attribution conclusion will happen every time. It was that person. There's a deterministic identifier. It's that person. It's unique, right? And MAIDs, so mobile advertising IDs, like the IDFA, GAID, were considered to allow for deterministic attribution. But did they? Did they really? I would argue that they didn't because of these people, right? These are what you might know as the self-attributing networks, right? So what happened in the kind of attribution system prior to ATT was that these SANs actually had priority in attributing installs or attributing anything, really. Why? Because they attributed themselves. They said, we're not going to use these third-party platforms for attribution when we bill you, right? When we sort of account for what we delivered to you, we're not going to use these third-party platforms, right? We're not going to use these measurement platforms. We're going to do it ourselves because we own the inventory, so we know what people did on our sites. And we also have a keyhole into your site because we have either an SDK or a pixel. And so we know what people did on our sites. We know what people do on your sites because we have full transparency there. We're going to make the matches, and we're going to just bill you for them, right? Now, you might have seen an ad on Facebook, gone into a hyper-casual app that's going to thrive going forward, clicked an ad, downloaded the game, and Facebook would have charged you for that install because you saw the ad on Facebook, and there's no collision detection because they do attribution on their own, right? So deterministic attribution, to my mind, didn't really exist because you could have collisions like that were not accounted for. Now, the measurement partners tried to dedupe them, but you still got charged for them. It doesn't matter. The measurement partner might have told you one thing, but you're paying for the double attribution. So you didn't really have deterministic attribution to begin with. And this has been going on for a long time. I wrote about IDFA zeroing back in 2016 because that's when LAT was introduced, right? So LAT meant that you could turn the IDFA off anyway, right? And 40% of the people in the US did. So you had 40% of users that didn't have an IDFA anyway. And so how did you even do attribution for them? Fingerprinting, right? So the idea that deterministic attribution was the sort of de facto model up until ATT was launched in July 2021 is kind of misleading, right? It didn't really exist. I don't know if you have any Better Call Saul fans in the house, but this was the best scene of the series by far, and so I included this screenshot. And so it's Walter White telling Saul, so you were always like this, right? So you were always like this. You were always using probabilistic attribution. Okay, what about fingerprinting? I know how to spell unreliable. I didn't do it here because I was going to see who was going to call me out on it, and none of you did. So you don't know how to spell unreliable. I do. I would say it's unreliable, it's imprecise, and it's not dependable long term. Why? Because I talked about private relay, right? Because this lady says you're not supposed to do it. Remember this lady, the nice lady? She said you're not supposed to do it. Don't do it. What did she say? What did she say? And I know how to speak English too. She said, but fingerprinting is never allowed, right? She said that. She looks like she's in a hostage situation. But I think she believes that. And if she believes that, it's probably going to manifest. Okay, so user-level deterministic measurement never really existed. The market is moving into a future dominated by campaign-level probabilistic attribution. So that's me saying, I don't know which user did this thing, but I think this campaign delivered that thing, right? I don't know which user did it. I got a bunch of users in my app. I don't know which of them did this thing. Or, I don't know which campaign delivered this user to who then did this thing. But I think this campaign generated some of these things, right? Using a probabilistic model. I'll go into that in a second. And then cohort-based deterministic measurement. So media mix modeling is a new topic for mobile advertisers, mobile app advertisers, but not a new concept, right? So it utilizes high-level inputs, which are basically just media spend and revenue, to predict channel-level outputs, so revenue, controlling for macro and environmental factors, right? So recession, inflation, cost of energy, all that kind of stuff. Usually these models are normalized by that. And modern implementations of these use a Bayesian approach to update priors related to things like lagged impact, which is called ad stock, which means I show an ad, and there's not an immediate impact, it happens a little bit later, right? And channel saturation, which means I can't just, if I see a channel is according to my media mix model, a channel is doing really well, I can't just pour unlimited money into it, because at some point it's going to saturate, right? So those ideas are kind of new-ish, and they're sort of moderated by like Bayesian inference. I'll talk a little bit about that, but it's really a big topic unto itself. So on the left here, you've got like ad stock, right? So this is going to be a model for ad stock. There's two models here. One is sort of like this curve, and the other is sort of just like a downward sloping kind of exponential curve. And that would just be some sort of estimation for how long it takes, or like the distribution of when these impacts happen, right, relative to the point of the ad exposure. And then on the right, you have what's known as a Hill function, and that just sort of represents saturation. So you have a couple different models there too. So one of them sort of like, it's low saturation, and then it's sort of S curves, that's the blue one, and then some of them are like logarithmic shaped, meaning like you have like, you can deploy a lot of money fast, and it saturates fast, and then it plateaus out, right? So these are just different ways of moderating the model. And what you're trying to do here is get some sense of ROAS, right? In a sort of a counterfactual estimation, right? So to say like, well, I didn't spend this money, but if I had, what would the ROAS have been, right? And in doing that, you can kind of get an estimation for like, how should you have deployed your money to fully optimize it, right? Given some mix, some channel mix, right? And so the way I think about it is this is kind of what you're trying to do. And this is just a diagram I came up with. On the left, you've got, kind of revenue by period, right? It's probably quarterly, right? And then you've got sort of channel spend, and these are the curves, right? And then on the right, you're trying to get some sort of channel level impact in terms of ROAS, right? Now, there's a couple flaws that you're probably already aware of just in looking at this. Well, this is known channels, right? Not new channels. So you need a data set of existing channels that you've deployed on to try to get some understanding of what the impact of that dollar of spend was, right, in terms of ROAS. So if I launch on a new channel, well, this model breaks, right, because it has no idea. So what are the pros of this approach? The pros is it allows for a relationship to be estimated using first-party data. This is all data that I have. I don't need to get data from anywhere else. This is all data that I own. It's totally fair game, right? It's data that I have, right? It's channel spend. That's my data. I get to have that. And it's revenue. I own that, right? And so I get to sort of build this model that estimates the relationship between $1 of ad spend and the sort of like overall ROAS effect of that dollar of ad spend within sort of like this known universe of channels using just my first-party data. I don't need to join it with anybody else's data, right? This is all sort of very privacy safe. What are the cons? It's difficult to dimensionalize that, right? It's difficult to break that out because the more dimensions you add, the less data you have by dimension, and the model just gets more spurious, right? And it's not ideal for short cadence reactivity. Who here does optimizations on day 0 ROAS? Or day 1? Or day 2? Or some early day ROAS? Well, you can't do that here. If you go to the CPG world, we were talking about this yesterday in the roundtable, a lot of times when they use a medium mix model, they're talking on a quarterly basis. So that means you get the marketing team together and say, okay, what do we think the impact of our spend was last quarter? And let's use that to sort of guide our spend this quarter. Well, you can't do that if you're a mobile games advertiser, right? You need to be much more reactive than that. Okay, so incrementality measurement. Probably heard about this too, right? Incrementality measurement attempts to quantify the incremental or additive value of media spend, right? So it attempts to answer a counterfactual. Again, but in a different way. What would the revenue impact have been if we didn't spend this money, right? So we spent the money. What happens if we didn't? What would have been the revenue impact? Now, if the revenue impact would have been greater than the amount of money that we spent, that was good spend. If it would have been 0, that was horrible spend, right? And if it's somewhere in the middle, you need to sort of re-estimate what that impact was, right? It can ingest more granular inputs than a media mix model, right? So we talked about revenue, ad spend. Well, an incrementality measurement model can ingest a lot of the other like sort of midterm, mid-funnel data that we actually have now, right? From frameworks like SK Ad Network, right? And just other like data that we can get from the ad platforms like click interactions, conversion rates, and stuff like that. So the pros of this model are that it generally allows for shorter feedback cycles, faster reactivity. So you're not talking on a quarterly basis, half-yearly basis with this. You can do it on a weekly basis, maybe daily basis. Cons, it requires more data engineering, right? It's harder to implement. It requires more data engineering. It's more bespoke, right? It doesn't work as well for offline to offline measurement and attribution. So media mix model, the idea there is you can just sort of push any ad spend into that. It could be TV, offline, whatever, and then you can use that to parse out any sort of revenue. Right? Well, with incrementality measurement model, what you're really trying to do is get online to online, or online to offline, but not offline to offline, right? Now, the way I think about the differences of these is that a media mix model will tell you, again, within that specific scope of ad spend, right, from some period, what does it predict to be the right allocation of spend across those media channels, right? Incrementality is different. It says for this specific channel, right, was this spend incremental or not, right? Did this actually produce revenue that you wouldn't have received if you didn't spend that money, right? So it's very channel level specific, and media mix model is like media mix specific, right? I had a post that I was gonna publish today that kind of went into more detail on all these concepts. Didn't finish it, but it'll come soon. So who remembers the Uber fraud trial? Okay, well, Uber sued a bunch of its media partners, right? They said, you were defrauding us. You were giving us bad traffic, and you knew it, right? And this is an exhibit from the lawsuit. And the dotted line is when they cut off all spend, right? And the black line is revenue. This is bad, right? They cut off all, or I think the green area chart was like total ad spend. So they didn't cut it off, but they cut it in half. And revenue stayed the same. That's bad. That revenue, that ad spend was not incremental. It was not generating revenue. They were spending money and getting nothing in return. That's bad, right? They didn't have an incrementality model. Okay, so I want to talk about I want to talk about two more things, but this one is like thinking about, okay, we've got a media mix model, incrementality measurement. These are sort of measurement methodologies, right? These are the ways to measure the effectiveness of our ad spend. But there's actually ways, there are ways that I've been preaching to actually just increase LTV, right? So if you think about, well, my cost per action went up, right? Because targeting got diluted. I'm reaching less relevant users, so my cost per action went up because the conversion rates went down, right? Well, then what can I do to remedy that? Well, I've got all my on-site data. It's all my data. It's all first party to me. So what I can do is use that data sort of, in a way that's totally divorced from the ad spend to just try to increase the value of the users, right? So the users that I'm getting are worth less than they were before. But if I tune my product to that, I can recoup some of that money just by providing more value to them such that they spend more money on my product, right? And the way to do that is personalization, right? So losing third-party signal for targeting optimization puts an onus on advertisers to make the most of their first-party data. You've got this big first-party data set. Instead of just sending it back to Facebook, do something with it to improve the product. The product is not static. It can be different for different users. And if you do that, you can improve the value of the users that you get, that you just discerned as being less valuable from the ad platforms because they entered the static product in the same way, right? Well, you can change what they actually do, what they see, what they're exposed to in your product, right? And so outsourcing all filtering / targeting to ad platforms made advertisers lazy and complacent, right? The users being acquired were vetted and targeted by the ad platforms, so advertisers could assume that they were relevant. Well, you can't make that assumption anymore. But apps generate an incredible amount of first-party data that can be used to personalize the user experience. And so if users are more expensive to acquire, advertisers must find ways to increase ARPU. So think about what we did before was we said, hey, Facebook, find me relevant users, right? And they found these very specific segments of people that they had determined to be valuable. They sent them to me, and the product experience was the same for all of them, but that was fine because Facebook was tuning this search exercise for relevant users based on this singular product experience, right? So that feedback loop intuited that product experience was the same for everyone. So it found the people that were the most specifically relevant for that product experience, but that doesn't have to be the case. Now you're getting what I call the big blob of traffic, right? And what you can do as an app developer is actually filter these users yourself, right? Look at what they do in early session experiences and then tailor the user experience to them based on your understanding of what past users did and how they reacted to these changes, right? So you basically can inherit from the big ad platforms, the O&O platforms, the SANs, you can inherit that exercise of sort of filtering out and finding the most relevant users within your own app, right? And all that data is first party to you, so it's all privacy safe. And so how do you do that? Well, you start thinking about, like, well, what things that a user does in your app are predictive for future value, right? And then as they do those things, put them on pathways to sort of expressing that value, right? And then also potentially packaging those into conversion values that you send back to the platforms. We're not going to talk about SKAd Network 4.0 today. I could do another 30-minute presentation on just that, but you're going to have more opportunities to do that, right, going forward. Okay, all that said, I'm going to go through this very quickly. I've got 3 minutes left. So that brings us to a content fortress. So I wrote an article a while back. I coined this term content fortress. I've been beating that drum a lot. I define a content fortress as any platform or portfolio of products supported by a rich advertising ecosystem serving owned and operated inventory using only first-party data, right? So this was sort of the way that we looked at the world pre-ATT, pre-ITP, whatever. They had the open web ecosystem and they had closed walled gardens. Well, now, lots of stuff is a walled garden and very little stuff is open web. So how do you become a walled garden? Well, some companies have done that through consolidation. There's been a lot of consolidation in this space, right? Why? Because they want to pair content with an ad platform so that they can do all the stuff that Facebook, Snapchat used to do within their own content ecosystem. There's been one more consolidating moment, right? And we've seen this happen in the streaming space too. So Netflix is launching ad-supported tier, Disney Plus launching an ad-supported tier. You want to bring the advertising into the content ecosystem. So not only can you sort of, well, I think in Netflix's case, try to expand the audience because they've seen subscriber churn, but to just, in some ways, create more value from the optimization systems that you already have, right? Because Netflix has a recommendation system that's probably the best in the world, right? So now just pair that with ads and then push people into games, right? Because Netflix is buying gaming studios, or use the gaming properties to drive people into the video platform, and you build a content fortress, right? You just pair the content with an ad platform. And there's lots of examples of these. I'm going to skip. This is TikTok bringing instant apps into the experience. This is Shopify. This is TikTok launching native shopping experiences, right? So you buy right from TikTok. When you buy on TikTok, buy on Facebook, buy on Twitter, that data is owned by those platforms. They can use that to target in the future. Instagram shopping. Shop Pay, right? Shopify launching payments infrastructure on retail websites. Well, guess who owns that purchase data when Shopify processes the payment? Shopify, right? Shopify owns that data. And they can use it for ads targeting. Ads targeting, Shopify, you say. Shopify launched an audience network. Shopify has an audience network now. Shopify builds audiences for its retailers, and it actually uploads those to their Facebook accounts so they can target relevant users, right? That's ATT compliant somehow, but they do it, right? Shopify owns the data because they process the transaction. It's first party to them, right? That's a content fortress. Okay, thank you very much.